Hi guys, welcome to the African Americans Oppressed Group Project. This was done by Allie Ledford, Melissa Harden, Chelsea Saylor, and Renee Gibson. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be talking about how African Americans have been oppressed throughout history, not just during slavery and the civil rights time, but we also discuss their oppression today through legislation, social culture, including police brutality. We discuss how social workers have influenced the change of the oppressed group and what we can continue to do. As you can see here, our interview, we have evidence of oppression since 1960 using cultural, economic, political, legal, and socio-demographic information, strategies used to influence policy, and the role of social work. Our interview was by Mr. Jared Garrett. He's a team leader for the Department of Juvenile Justice in Lexington, Kentucky. He's actually based out of Frankfort now because he does work for DJJ as a whole. His position is in collaboration with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Jared discusses how oppression continues to plague the African American community. In particular, he discusses juveniles because that's the group that he works with, particularly in Fayette County, where he was a probation and parole officer, and then as he's progressed in his career, he now works statewide. We asked Jared, when you began working with probation and parole and then DJJ, what was your initial observation? Jared gives us a perspective as a state employee that, advocates on behalf of African Americans and their oppression along with other minorities, but he's also giving us the perspective of an African American man growing up and things that he's noticed throughout his life. Jared explains that it's not just African Americans that's oppressed, it's also Hispanics, but, he sees the oppression of African American youth primarily because they were kids of color, and those areas tend to be more heavily policed. Interventions that may be used with Caucasian families or Caucasian youth aren't always used with African Americans, and that was one of his systematic issues that he discusses, that the reason for recidivism and why they perpetually continue to get involved with the system. We asked Jared, do you believe that African Americans are being oppressed presently, and can you give him an example? And he said, if you look at the criminal justice system as a whole, there's data every day that says that kids of color are being oppressed in the majority, 16 counties, although Kentucky has 120, he stresses that as they look at detention for the state, those 16 counties where there's a large population of minorities, in particular African Americans, they show the highest level of oppression. We asked Jared, what's the most important policy that could be advocated for African Americans? And criminal justice reform was his answer. There is many issues within criminal justice that we may not always be aware of, but that play a huge part in the oppression of African Americans. So we talk about this a lot, how the criminalization for marijuana, how that could be changed. Whereas some states make money off marijuana, Jared stresses how we're still a punitive state. There's still punishments for something as a possession of marijuana charge. We asked, do you think that oppression of African Americans were once experiencing is the same today? Has anything been resolved, and is there new oppression of African Americans emerging? And he explains that the oppression, although it may not be as in your face as slavery, it is still present, but it's covert. It's underlying racism. It's racist thoughts, the way you may be walking down the street, you see a homeless person that may be African American, and you grab your purse a little tighter. Or you're in a gas station and a group of African American young males come in, and you automatically, your senses heighten. That's what he means by covert. We asked, what else can we do to advocate for African Americans as an oppressed group? And the point he wanted us most to notice is that we need to listen. We need to understand where they're coming from and take the time to hear their plight and their concerns. It's not about us deciding for them what their oppression is, but we need to hear how they feel oppressed. The evidence of oppression that we will go over is beginning since 1960. The timeline of oppression pre-1960. In order to understand oppression since the 1960s, you have to start at the beginning. 1619, African Americans were brought to the U.S. for the purpose of slavery. 1865, the Civil War ended in the South, but freed slaves were given no financial help by the federal government. In the 1880s to 1890s, Jim Crow laws legally segregated black and whites. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the Jim Crow laws. In the 1950s and 60s, as part of the civil rights and black power movements, African Americans fought against segregation and racial injustices by boycotting public demonstrations, sit-ins, and marches. This forces the government to enact civil rights legislation. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education declared that school segregation was unconstitutional. In this video, you can see that where the civil rights of 1964 and 1965, African Americans, they gained some equality, but again, not all. In reality, oppression continued to plague the South. It was a cultural imbalance that people just could not get over. It was us against them, and understanding the oppression that they had faced for many, many generations was unfathomable. Cultural evidence of oppression since 1960. It is argued that racial contract existed between whites and persons who were colonized by European powers since the 18th century. Under this so-called contract, humans are divided into two groups, whites and non-whites. The latter are given inferior moral status and subordinate civil standing. And there are many objective forms to this of discrimination, including employment, housing. In the case of African Americans, this subordinate status was originally maintained through slavery. Currently, other measures are used to enforce this contract, which the police and penal system are included. This racial contract is one way to explain the ongoing police brutality of African Americans, as well as the uneven application of the death penalty to whites and African Americans.